He drove hundreds of miles to pick up his wife and his 2 kids and take them home. He believed the fight was over. He was shot seconds after he walked through the door, and every single person waiting inside that house was family. Matthew Restelli was a father. He lived with his wife, Kathryn Restelli, in Temecula, California. They had 2 children together. Their life looked ordinary from the outside, a young family building a future under the California sun. But behind closed doors, their marriage was under considerable strain. The problems grew until they reached a breaking point. The strain became a fracture. Kathryn decided she needed space. She packed up her things and took the children with her. They did not just move down the street or to a neighboring town, they left the state entirely. Kathryn traveled hundreds of miles east, seeking refuge at the home of her mother, Tracey Grist, in West Jordan, Utah. The distance created a chasm between the couple, turning marital problems into a logistical and emotional crisis. While staying with her mother, Kathryn began to explore what a permanent separation might look like. She took a significant step. She spoke with a divorce attorney. The move to Utah was not a brief vacation. It was a clear signal that the marriage was in serious trouble. For Matthew, his family was suddenly gone. His wife and his 2 young children were in another state, living with his mother-in-law. The conversations they had were undoubtedly difficult, filled with the weight of their unresolved issues. Kathryn, sheltered in her mother's house, was contemplating a future without him. The physical distance mirrored the emotional gulf that had opened up between them. The question was whether that gulf could ever be closed. For a time, it seemed possible. Despite the consultation with a divorce lawyer, the lines of communication remained open. A series of text messages would later show a shift in the dynamic. A reconciliation appeared to be on the horizon. Matthew believed he was on the verge of putting his family back together. He had a reason to hope. His wife had reached out to him with a specific request. She told him she wanted to come home. She wanted him to come get them. It was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But there was a catch, a reason he had to be the one to make the long journey. Yeah. On the night of July 12, 2024, the quiet of the West Jordan neighborhood was shattered. At approximately 10:05 p.m., residents heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire. It was not one shot, but multiple shots fired in quick succession. Alarmed and frightened neighbors immediately began calling 911 to report the violent disruption. They told dispatchers they heard gunshots coming from the direction of Tracey Grist's home. The calls marked the moment a hidden plot erupted into public violence. When officers from the West Jordan Police Department arrived, they entered the house to a grim and static scene. They found Matthew Restelli inside. He was dead. He had been shot almost immediately after entering the home he drove so far to reach. He had walked through the front door expecting to see his wife, expecting to see his children ready to take them home. Instead, he had walked into an ambush. The officers secured the scene and began the slow, methodical process of a homicide investigation. The family he had come to collect were all there witnesses to the final, violent moments of his life. The initial story given to law enforcement came from Tracey Grist's boyfriend, a man named Kevin Ellis. He was the one who had fired the gun. Ellis told police that he had acted in self-defense. He claimed that Matthew Restelli had entered the home and had come at him aggressively. Ellis stated that Matthew was armed with a knife and that he had no choice but to shoot him to protect himself and to protect the others in the house. It was a clear and simple explanation for the use of deadly force. On its face, it was a plausible scenario, a domestic dispute that had escalated tragically. The self-defense claim hinged on one critical piece of evidence: the knife. This physical evidence seemed to corroborate Kevin Ellis's account of the events. It suggested that Matthew had arrived not for a peaceful reconciliation, but for a violent confrontation. The presence of the knife was the central pillar of the self-defense narrative. But investigators are trained to question everything. The investigation would soon focus intensely on that knife, on where it came from, and on how it ended up in Matthew Restelli's hand. That question would change everything. The investigation into the knife yielded a startling discovery. Forensic analysis, a review of financial records, connected the weapon not to Matthew, but to someone inside the house. The knife found in Matthew Restelli's hand was traced back to a purchase made months earlier. The person who bought it was Tracey Grist, Matthew's mother-in-law. This finding severely undermined the self-defense claim. It suggested the knife was not a weapon Matthew had brought with him from California, but one that was already present in the house. It raised the possibility that the weapon had been planted to stage a scene. The timeline of the 911 call also came under scrutiny. Prosecutors highlighted a critical gap. They argued that Tracey Grist did not call for help immediately after the shooting. Instead, they said she waited. According to the prosecution's timeline, a full 8 minutes passed between the moment Kevin Ellis shot Matthew and the moment Grist dialed 911. What happened during those 8 minutes? The prosecutor argued that this delay was not an accident or a result of panic. They contended it was a crucial window of time used to stage the scene, to place the knife, and to get their story straight before calling the police. The case against the family began to solidify. The plan was not spontaneous. Prosecutors said it was researched and carefully considered. They presented evidence that went far beyond the text messages that lured Matthew to Utah. They introduced a series of internet searches made on devices belonging to the family inside the house. Testimony showed that members of the family had been looking into a high-profile murder case that had captivated the nation. They had searched for information about the Donna Adelson case, a story involving a family conspiracy, a murder-for-hire plot targeting a former son-in-law. The parallels were chilling. Prosecutors said the searches did not stop there. Tracey Grist, Kathryn's mother, had allegedly conducted her own research. The state argued that she looked up similar cases exploring stories where family members were involved in intricate plots to commit murder. This digital trail suggested a level of premeditation that directly contradicted the story the family would later tell police. It was not just a fleeting thought, it was, prosecutors said, a subject of intense interest and study. The searches provided a window into what was being discussed and contemplated inside the Utah home while Matthew was driving toward them. This evidence became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It suggested a motive, a method, a blueprint for a crime. The state's argument was that the family was not just idly curious about true crime. The searches for the Adelson case, similar family conspiracies, were presented as a form of how-to research. It was evidence that the idea of killing Matthew Restelli was not a new one, but one that had been cultivated and explored in the weeks and days leading up to his arrival. The digital footprints left by the family created a narrative of intent. It was a story that began long before the night of the shooting. It started with a search bar and a query. Why would a family be so interested in these specific dark stories? The prosecution offered a simple, terrifying answer. They were planning to create a story of their own. They were looking for a way to remove Matthew from their lives permanently and get away with it. The internet searches provided a silent, damning timeline of an idea turning into an alleged conspiracy. The defense attorneys for Tracey Grist and Kevin Ellis worked to counter the prosecution's narrative. Grist's lawyer, Dana Facemeyer, argued that the state was weaving a story that was not supported by the facts. Facemeyer offered alternative explanations for the evidence. She suggested the internet searches were simple curiosity. She argued the events of that night were a tragic confluence of misunderstood intentions and fear. Counsel cautioned the jury against the temptation to invent stories to fill in the gaps. They urged the jury to rely only on the concrete evidence presented. They asked the jurors to see the reasonable doubt in the state's conspiracy theory. Despite these efforts, the weight of the evidence proved overwhelming for the juries. The testimony from Kathryn proved especially powerful. The trials for Kevin Ellis and Tracey Grist proceeded separately, but the outcomes were damning. However, they acquitted him of the conspiracy charge. That suggested they believed he had acted that night but was not part of the initial planning. He had pulled the trigger, and the jury held him responsible for the killing of Matthew Restelli. Tracey Grist's trial followed, and the outcome was even more decisive. The jury listened to her daughter's testimony. They saw evidence of the internet searches. They saw the purchased knife. They heard about the delayed 911 call. The jury concluded she was, as the prosecution argued, the mastermind. On May 15, 2026, The jury found Tracey Grist guilty on all counts she faced. That included a conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. The verdict affirmed the prosecution's narrative that she had orchestrated the entire plot. She had lured her son-in-law to Utah, and it culminated in the final act of violence inside her home. The legal proceedings moved from verdict to sentencing, bringing the consequences into sharp focus. Kathryn Restelli, who had pleaded guilty to murder, conspiracy, and felony discharge of a firearm, faced a sentence of up to life in prison for her role. Kevin Ellis, convicted of murder, also faced a lengthy prison term. For Tracey Grist, the architect of the plot, the judge delivered the maximum possible sentence. She was sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder, with additional consecutive terms for the other charges, ensuring she would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. The trials laid bare the anatomy of a family conspiracy. The prosecution successfully argued that this was not a case of self-defense. The evidence, from the damning internet searches about the Adelson case to the knife purchased by Tracey Grist, painted a picture of cold, deliberate premeditation. The 8-minute delay before the 911 call was presented as the time needed to arrange the scene, to transform a murder into a story of self-preservation. It was a story the jury ultimately did not believe. Kathryn Restelli's testimony was the key that unlocked the conspiracy. By turning against her mother, she provided a narrative from the inside. She told the court about her own complicity, her own role in texting her husband and convincing him to make the fatal drive. But she also placed the primary motivation and the unwavering resolve squarely on her mother. Her testimony that Tracey Grist had vowed to do it anyway sealed her mother's fate. It was the voice of a co-conspirator confirming the state's darkest suspicions about the family matriarch. The defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt were systematically dismantled. The argument that the family was simply curious about true crime cases fell flat against the sheer specificity of the searches. The claim of self-defense was rendered unbelievable by the revelation that the supposed weapon, the knife in Matthew's hand, was bought by Tracey Grist. Each piece of the defense's narrative collapsed under the weight of the prosecution's evidence. The jury was left with a chilling and coherent story of a trap laid by a family against one of its own. The sentences delivered a final, stark measure of accountability. Kevin Ellis was the hand that held the gun. Kathryn Restelli was the bait in the trap. Tracey Grist was the mind that conceived the plan. Each was found legally responsible for their part in the death of Matthew Restelli, a father who drove hundreds of miles believing he was going to bring his family home. The legal system delivered its judgment, closing the case with guilty verdicts and long prison sentences.